Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 19 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Seattle Kraken and lost by a score of 4-1. And both of these teams were really looking to rebound coming into tonight's game. The Kraken, because it was just over a week ago where the Sharks beat them 6-1 in Seattle, and so they obviously want some revenge there. But from a Sharks perspective, it was just a couple of nights ago when they played against the Calgary Flames, and that was their worst performance of the entire season by far. It might not look so on paper, but they were just absolutely awful in that game, and so they needed a bounce back type of performance here tonight. And despite this loss actually not looking great, one goal, you give up 4, not so fantastic on paper, I do think that the Sharks actually performed rather well here tonight. I think you could easily make the argument that they were the better team, and what ends up being the difference maker in this game is actually the exact thing that the Sharks were using to beat opponents previously. It was goaltending. Nedeljkovic certainly wasn't bad in this one. He lets in 3 goals, but he didn't really have much of a chance on any of them. However, Philip Grubauer was absolutely lights out for Seattle. He didn't even start the game for the Kraken. He came in after Matt Murray injured himself trying to make the save on this Wenberg goal near the end of the first period. But once Grubauer came in, he shut the door completely. Tons of elite saves being made, which is surprising because usually when the Sharks have faced off against Grubauer, they have absolutely lit him up. But here tonight, he had the Sharks number. He was the MVP by far for the Kraken in this game. And so the Sharks, they had their looks, they had their chances, but just could not find a way to beat him. So if this had been the type of loss that the Sharks had actually sustained against Calgary a couple of nights ago, I think it would have actually been perfectly acceptable. You have a 4-game winning streak and it comes to an end even though you played very, very well. I think you would be perfectly fine with that. The fact that this follows on that Calgary game certainly makes it feel a little bit worse, but I do think that you still can't be all that disappointed with how this one plays out. Starts off with a Jaden Schwartz goal in the first period. That makes it 1-0 Seattle. But then Alex Wenberg is able to tie up this game on the power play as the Sharks go for a bit of a different look on their top unit. I think a lot of us were expecting eventually John Klingberg to get kicked off that top unit. That is not what the Sharks do. Instead, they actually replaced Tyler Toffoli in favor of Alex Wenberg. I don't hate this decision because I don't think Toffoli has really done much of anything for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. And Wenberg is no stranger to the Sharks power play either. He actually plays when they have a 4-on-3 and they have a 5-on-3. He goes for that net front presence, and the Sharks have now decided to try that 5-on-4. So they've moved Will Smith off the high wall into the bumper position, and they have allowed Celebrini and Eklund the entirety of those half walls to try and make some plays, get them moving a little bit more. These are two offensively skilled players, so I certainly understand the perspective. And then you have Wenberg as the net front, and you still have John Klingberg, for whatever reason, as your power play quarterback. And it does strike immediately, the first power play of the game. The Sharks get this goal. Maybe the Kraken caught a little bit by surprise as they leave Wenberg completely uncovered here. If you're doing the pre-scout on the Sharks power play, you don't expect this type of setup that they have. But the Kraken adapted quickly, and the Sharks showing that there is some growing pains here because they got 5 more power plays after this, and none of those managed to strike. So they actually end up 1 for 6 on the night, which isn't even that great. This is a below average power play percentage, and so that is a kind of another big difference maker here in this game. So it is a 1-1 score after the first period. We then head into the second period where we really have the story of the night, which is that the Sharks appeared to have scored a second goal in this one coming from Will Smith. He blocks a shot, he gets a breakaway, he makes a nice move. He is robbed by Philip Grubauer, but as the puck bounces around a little bit, it eventually crosses the goal line. Now it is immediately waved off by the officials, and I'd originally thought that the reason for that was because it seemed as though the net had come off before the puck crossed the goal line, but then on an actual review, you see that it crosses when the net is still on, and so it should have been a good goal. And I was thinking, maybe they'll talk about goalie interference, even though I thought that was kind of a stretch anyway. But the officials pull out something that I was not expecting whatsoever, where they call this one no goal because of a distinct kicking motion. And this came as a massive surprise because usually the NHL is incredibly strict about what is and isn't a distinct kicking motion, with the big thing being is that you are allowed to angle your skate in such a way that when the puck deflects off of it, it will not be called a distinct kicking motion. And there is no better proof of exactly that than literally the first goal of this game from Jaden Schwartz. He angles his skate in such a way that with his momentum in his skating, the puck deflects off of it and heads into the net. And this is not called a kicking motion. I had no issues with that because the NHL had set the precedent over the last few years that that is perfectly fine and absolutely allowed. And so the fact that they somehow meet and decide that this ends up being a no goal call on the kicking motion makes zero sense to me whatsoever, and makes me believe that this is the worst call of the season from a San Jose Sharks perspective for sure. I had complained about the officiating back in the Florida Panthers game a few days ago, but the thing was that was off of, a lot of missed penalties. Oh, they missed this tripping call, they missed this interference call, but at the very least, those happen at game speed, and so it is somewhat understandable that sometimes you're just going to miss those ones. But the fact that you have the opportunity to look this over, the referees, the officials all get together to discuss this. They likely discuss with off-ice officials as well, and then the brain trust comes to the conclusion that this ends up being a no-goal call. That makes zero sense whatsoever. I have no idea how this one gets called back, and it ends up being a very big momentum shifter in this game because that could have given the Sharks a 2-1 lead, given them the confidence that they can beat Grubauer, and maybe the game looks completely different after, but instead what ends up happening, it's no goal, and the Kraken are able to rattle off 2 goals in quick succession in the second period to take a 3-1 lead heading into the third. Now, I can't fully blame this missed call, obviously, because there's still a good amount of time left in this game, and the Sharks definitely had the opportunity to still turn this one into their favor, so it's far from an excuse, but it is something that is just an absolutely horrible call. In the third period, the Sharks, they get a few chances here or there. They get a bunch more power plays, but eventually it is Jaden Schwartz, shorthanded, into the empty net, who puts this one away and gives the Kraken that 4-1 victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, we did get some changes, some pretty significant ones on the forward lines. After that performance against the Calgary Flames, Warsofsky felt it necessary to completely switch things up, and I don't necessarily blame him, especially when it comes to the Sharks top line. I have, been very much in the kind of corner of not wanting Toffoli onto this top unit with Celebrini and Smith, and finally that does change. So Celebrini and Smith are actually joined by Philip Kurashev. That came as a little bit of a surprise because I thought, if anything, this would be Colin Graf here, considering we did see Graf briefly with these two players in the third period against the Minnesota Wild, and it worked out rather well. On top of that, Kurashev has actually been trialed with these two players before, back at the beginning of the season, and it did not look pretty good at all in those first few games, so I didn't think that they would go back to that, but at the very least, this is still preferred over what Toffoli brings, because Kurashev does have some pace, does have some speed in his game, and it immediately looked very, very good. Like the first 2 shifts of this game, it completely dominated. This line did. Kurashev even came very close to scoring, hits 2 posts. Well, it's one shot that hits off of both posts. That almost came in, and that was almost a goal. But after those first couple of shifts, it definitely slowed down a good bit and didn't end up being that great of a line here for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to Macklin Celebrini first, I thought he was okay here tonight, but certainly not his usual self. I thought he was just not handling pucks super well in this game. Again, it was an okay performance, but I do expect a little bit more from him. He does end up picking up a primary assist here, so helps keep pace there in the points standings, but still not all that fantastic. What's interesting is that, usually in the past I have heavily praised Celebrini and then talked about his 2 wingers that maybe let him down a little bit. Quite the opposite here in this game, because while Celebrini I don't think was at his best, I actually felt as though Will Smith had a very good game. He gets a couple of breakaways here. He absolutely should have had a goal. He set up a couple of great chances, including that Kurashev one that does go off of both posts. And I think, especially after that goal ended up getting called off, he played with an extra sort of oomph in his step, which was nice to see. There were a couple of moments where I felt as though Will Smith fell into that trap of just kind of deferring to Celebrini a little bit too much. Certain zone entries where he looks for the pass to Celebrini despite the fact that he is not wide open. And yes, Celebrini does have the tendency to be able to get past multiple players who are covering him, but it is still kind of a low percentage play, and it felt as though it would have probably been better for Smith to just hold on to the puck or take a shot or go back in deep, whatever the case may be. So there were a couple of hiccups there, but I still thought all in all, Smith was rather solid in this game. And then when it comes to Kurashev, outside of that strong start that this line did end up having, I do think Kurashev kind of faded a little bit as it went on, but I do believe it was good enough to give this trio another chance going into the next game, especially since the game as a whole here against Seattle was certainly not too bad. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Eklund with Wennberg and Graf. And so this is also a reason for why I was surprised Graf didn't get played onto that top line, because you could have put him there with Celebrini and Smith, which would allow you to maintain the trio of Kurashev, Eklund, and Wennberg, which we know has had a good amount of success. Even in that last game against Calgary, where everybody was very terrible, of the lines that were all bad, the second line was like the best of the worst. And so I felt as though they probably could have been kept the same, especially since we know that they have offensive chemistry. And it should be noted that the San Jose Sharks offensively have not actually been all that great as of late. In their last 5 games, they've only managed 7 goals if we don't count that empty netter, which I will not. And the fact is that in those 7 goals, Celebrini has either scored or at least directly contributed on 6 of them, which means only 1 goal has been scored by the San Jose Sharks in their last 5 games that didn't involve Celebrini whatsoever. And so you would think you'd really want to maximize the offense that your second, third, and fourth lines can actually generate, and they didn't quite do that with the setup that they went with. Now, this is not to say that this second line played poorly. I actually thought they played rather well from an individual standpoint. Eklund, Wennberg, and Graf, each of them were quite solid defensively. I thought Graf had a really nice game on the penalty kill, as he usually does, and so it certainly ended up being fine. But in terms of actually generating really high danger opportunities, it just didn't quite happen for this trio. The same can actually be said about the Sharks' third line, though this was a big surprise here. I thought that this was a third line that was not going to work any way whatsoever, and this was just kind of like the 3 odd men out of the top 9. So Gaudette, Foley, and Dellandrea get put together just because there's not really many other options, but it surprised me quite greatly. I thought Gaudette had one of his better games of the entire season. He was all over it, very involved, high energy, very physical. I thought Ty Dellandrea was okay in this one, and then I thought Toffoli looked a little bit better than he has as of late, but the same criticisms go towards this third line as I said for the second line. Each of these players were individually good, especially Adam Gaudette, but when it came to generating like really dangerous offensive chances at even strength, it just didn't quite end up happening, and this is a major reason for why the Sharks actually have 0 even strength goals in any of their last 3 games, and why they only have 7 goals in their last 5 games as a whole. Like, you're just not really getting enough offense in this 5-on-5 play at this point. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, here is where we actually had the call-up for this game. Jeff Skinner, as we know, got injured in the one previously against the Calgary Flames, and so everybody was expecting somebody to come up here and be that 12th forward. I had thought that it was going to be Ethan Cardwell because he was quite impressive in his previous showing with the San Jose Sharks, really not all that long ago, really only just a few days prior, but there was also the possibility that the Sharks might go for a guy like Quinton Musty or maybe Igor Chernyshov. Both of them have been having a pretty solid start to their Barracuda season, to their professional careers, and so a chance to maybe give one of these young promising prospects for the Sharks an opportunity to see what they can do on like a third line position here in the NHL. But the Sharks, they do surprise me by calling up Zach Ostapchuk. Now, they had called him up previously as well, but unlike Cardwell, he did not play a single game. But it seems as though the Sharks did want to get Adam Gaudette outside of that fourth line center role, at which point it frees up a spot there, and Ostapchuk is likely the best option for the Sharks for that fourth line center position. I know Mike Greer acquired him hoping for him to be a third line center. I still don't really see that whatsoever, but in this fourth line position, I thought Ostapchuk was all right. He actually managed to generate a little bit of offense here in this game. I think defensively there was a somewhat of a struggle. This line did get caught on a couple of times in their own zone and had some issues, but all in all, not the worst showing from Zach Ostapchuk. When it comes to Barclay Goodrow, impressive, I guess, on the Sharks penalty kill for sure. And then when it comes to Ryan Reeves, is getting physical, is getting involved, didn't really generate a ton of offense here in this particular game. And defensively, certainly had that kind of usual behind the play type of issues when it comes to his just general level of speed. But I guess not the worst of worst games for Ryan Reeves. Then we get to the Sharks defensively, and this is where we have the kind of major talking points, I would say, for this particular video. So the first thing that I do want to talk about is, of course, the 2 defensemen who end up sitting out. I had mentioned after that game against the Calgary Flames, where it was so bad for the San Jose Sharks, that it was quite likely that Warsofsky would look and say, well, the solution to this is Nick Leddy, and indeed, that is what ends up happening. Nicoletti does step back into the lineup, so does Shakir Mukhamadullin, which means that two players do have to step out. One of them is Timothy Liljegren, which maybe doesn't come as that much of a surprise because he was a healthy scratch a couple of games ago, and the other one is Sam Dickinson, which is absolutely not a surprise either. But I am rather frustrated with the Sam Dickinson situation in general, and it's not that I am frustrated with the player in particular, far from it. I don't think I'm going to be frustrated with a young 19-year-old rookie defenseman, but instead how the Sharks have actually handled his deployment. Yes, this is also because of the kind of ice time that he has been getting in the games that he has played, where it feels as though like the most he's ever had was like 16 or 17 minutes, which just doesn't feel like enough for a player who has shown a little bit of promise. But the big thing is more so the games that he has and has not been playing. And this goes back a couple of weeks ago, when the San Jose Sharks decided to keep Sam Dickinson in the NHL more long-term. After that 9-game window, they decide, you know what, we'll give him that 10th game, we'll kick in his entry-level contract. And we saw immediate payoff for that decision, because in the very next game, his 10th of the season against the Detroit Red Wings, he had his best performance of the year by far. He scores his first career goal. He was all over the ice in that one, and it seemed as though it was going to be the start of a really promising stretch for Sam Dickinson, that he had turned that corner, and indeed he followed that up with a maybe not as impressive game, but still very good one against the Seattle Kraken, where he showed a ton of confidence jumping up into the play, a couple of defensive errors, but still something that you did not want to squash, you did not want to get rid of, because he was trying to be in the rush and jump up into the play, and I thought that there was a ton of promise there shown. And so naturally you would think after two very good games that the San Jose Sharks would try to take that confidence that was clearly blossoming and help foster and grow it and kind of begin to ease him into greater and greater minutes, maybe eventually give him some power play time, maybe eventually give him some penalty kill time, because eventually he's going to end up being key contributors in both of those areas sometime soon in the future. And that they would really kind of end up scaling up Sam Dickinson into a key contributor down for the rest of this season. But instead, the Sharks head in the complete different direction and decide to actually have him sit for the following game against the Winnipeg Jets. And so they take a defenseman who was on a roll across a couple of games, his two best of the entire season, and they have him sit out. And then in returning to the lineup the next day against the Florida Panthers, he has an okay performance, and then the next one against the Minnesota Wild, it is again okay, and then the next one against the Calgary Flames, it was quite bad, but he did not reach ever the same heights that he had against Detroit and against Seattle, and this just feels like some extreme mismanagement. And I had mentioned it at the time, and Warsofsky's whole point was, well, it's not performance related, this is part of the development plan, but at some point you have to change course and you have to make a split-second decision there in the moment and say, you know what, even if we didn't want him to play this back-to-back, even if we wanted to sit him out one of these games, he's playing so well that we simply can't remove him from the lineup. It's the same situation as with Macklin Celebrini last year. Celebrini, when he was healthy, played every single game. I'm sure maybe the Sharks came in with some level of idea that there would be a development plan, but he was so impressive so consistently that even in back-to-backs, even when he looked a little bit fatigued, they had him in the lineup every single time. So why is it that when Sam Dickinson strings together a couple of really, really good games, he is benched for the very next one, kind of hurting his confidence for sure? It kind of goes back to a just simple fact that, and this isn't even just Ryan Warsofsky, but the Sharks staff as a whole, up to the management perspective, they are rather stubborn. They came in with the idea, okay, Sam Dickinson, he's going to sit out the back-to-backs and we're going to have him on this plan. And even when, there's contradictory information, even when he is playing well, they say, you know what, we're going to stick to it. And it's the same situation that plays out with John Klingberg, for instance. They came in with the idea that he was going to be the top power play guy, that he was going to be on that top unit. And even if it's not working out, and even when they are they are shown evidence that Dmitry Orlov working a lot better on that top unit, they say, you know what, nope, we brought in Klingberg for a reason and he's going to stick with it. It goes back to even the beginning of last season, kind of, dredging up the past here. But after Danil Gushin had started off so exceptionally well in the preseason, like 10 points across 4 games, the San Jose Sharks were so set in their ways of like, these are our 14 starting forwards, that despite, yes, they did end up including Danil Gushin on the starting roster, they had him play the 4th line in the first game and then healthy scratched him for the next 3. And the only reason he even remained in the NHL at that point after was because Celebrini happened to get injured. It just so seems that the San Jose Sharks come in with an exact idea of what they are looking for, with the exact setup that they are expecting for their players. And when something changes and something happens where a player does very well or a player does very poorly, they stick with their plan no matter what. They don't make the adaptations, they don't make the changes to actually adjust to this new information. And that is a little bit disappointing and a little bit frustrating here when it comes to Sam Dickinson in this situation. So he sits this one out. It kind of makes some sense because obviously he was not good against the Calgary Flames, but you also kind of feel like, well, every single defenseman was very bad in that game, and it is Sam Dickinson who ends up being punished anyway. Now, when it comes to the actual performances of the defensemen here tonight, we have the San Jose Sharks top pairing, Dmitry Orlov and John Klingberg. So Klingberg finds his way onto the Sharks top pairing, and also he was the most played defenseman here in this game. Kind of makes sense because the Sharks did have 6 power plays, but still, it's not something that looks all that great, especially since Klingberg did not have a particularly good game here tonight. I know a lot of people are probably hoping that I'm going to skewer John Klingberg's performance here tonight, and well, here I am doing so. I think it would be disingenuous to say that Klingberg comes out here and doesn't bring anything to the table, right? It's not as though that he is just consistently bad in every possible situation and he has 0 positives to his game. That is false. I don't think that we can say that. There were some bright moments for John Klingberg in his performance tonight. He had a great stretch pass up to Will Smith that led to one of his partial breakaways. He had a great shift there late in the first period. I think it was with the third line where he kept the puck alive in the zone multiple times, went down low, made some plays happen. There are positives for Klingberg. There is the ability to contribute offensively, and I really think this is what Warsofsky continues to kind of hang on to, where he looks at this team that doesn't exactly have a lot of very notable offensive talent, and he sees that the Sharks are kind of struggling when it comes to breaking out of their own zone and getting that strong first pass. And he views John Klingberg as like the best possible player to be able to do that. And so that's why he continues to give him these minutes. But the fact is that these few and far between good plays are heavily overshadowed by the many mistakes that he ends up making. I've talked about those errors and those giveaways that were heavily protected and kind of masked over because of the elite performances from the San Jose Sharks goaltenders as of late. Well, finally one does end up in the back of the net. This is this first Jaden Schwartz goal as Klingberg attacks the man at the blue line, misses on the stick check, gets skated around, falls over, creates this 2-on-1 down low that leads to this Jaden Schwartz goal. So that is a major mistake for Klingberg. And there were other where he failed to keep pucks in at the blue line, one where he gives up a 2-on-1 going the other way. Just these types of mistakes and these types of poor D-zone coverage that end up, generally leading to more goals against than goals for. And we have heard the comparison that, for whatever reason, Ryan Warsofsky gave to John Klingberg about, he has shades of Erik Karlsson in him. Well, if we go back to the last time that Erik Karlsson was with the San Jose Sharks in the 22-23 season, he also had a tendency to make many massive mistakes in pretty much every single game that he played, 2 or 3 huge errors that could frequently find themselves into the back of the net, but it was acceptable, and he even won a James Norris Trophy that year because at the end of the season he had 101 points. You can accept some defensive mistakes when you're also contributing 2 or 3 points pretty much every single night. John Klingberg on the year currently has just 5 points in 13 games. And the thing is that 2 of those 5 points came on 5-on-3s back at the beginning of the season. 1 other was on the power play. Just 2 even strength points across 13 games. Karlsson, I mentioned, had 101 across the year. I believe 75 or so of those were at even strength. So Karlsson was able to contribute pretty much every single game. Klingberg cannot do that even remotely so. And so right now you're not actually getting much offense from Klingberg. He is getting outscored by players like Dmitry Orlov twice as much, and is at a similar point totals to a guy like Shakir Mukhamadullin, who hasn't even played many games at all this season. You're not getting enough offense from John Klingberg in terms of actual on-paper production, and you're just getting tons of defensive errors that are not being actually supported whatsoever. And so this is a player who is continuing to get ice time. And again, I sort of understand the perspective of Ryan Warsofsky, but it is a desperate type of perspective here. And I think at some point you kind of have to face the music that John Klingberg maybe needs to sit out a couple of games, especially when he has truly bad performances like we have seen at times from him this season. I mentioned that, every single defenseman for the San Jose Jose Sharks was bad last game, and indeed, when confronted about the mistakes that Klingberg had made against Calgary, Warsofsky said exactly that. But the thing is that when every single defenseman is bad, it is the young guy who seems to get punished for it, like Dickinson here tonight. But if you go back to the beginning of the season when we saw John Klingberg in just the second game of the year, both Klingberg and Nick Leddy actually have genuinely awful performances against the Anaheim Ducks there in that second game. And usually you would say, well, they're both new players, and so you give them kind of the benefit of the doubt. But that's okay when it's like an average or below average or even a bad performance. But Klingberg and Leddy were truly, truly terrible in that game. Like literally two of the worst defensive performances we have actually seen all season long. And if you exclude the Calgary game, it is literally the two worst defensive performances we have seen all season long. And yet, despite that, you know who ends up getting the consequence? You know who ends up sitting out? It's Shakir Mukhamadullin. So even when it is Klingberg who is the worst defenseman and everybody else is actually pretty good, it is the young guys who have to deal with the accountability and the consequences anyway. And that just does not feel particularly fair. Now, when it comes to that Sharks' second defensive pairing here, we have Ferraro and Mukhamadullin. Ferraro, I actually thought had a pretty solid outing. He's actually been relatively kind of steady for the San Jose Sharks as of late. Not that great, but certainly not terrible whatsoever. Obviously, the Calgary Flames game being the exception, so that is quite nice to see from him. When it comes to Mukhamadullin, there were some pretty major mistakes here. Obviously, the pinch, very poor read on this third goal for the Seattle Kraken. That one was not really all that great. It didn't have the support from Adam Gaudette, but still, you kind of want to stay back in a situation like that. And then we also saw a moment, I don't remember if this was in the first or the second period, where he's holding the puck in the defensive zone and he's holding it for like a good 10 seconds and then ends up holding it for too long, gets pressured, gives it up, leads to some zone time for Seattle. You simply just cannot make that type of mistake. Besides that, there were some positives that ended up making this like an okay game for Shakir Mukhamadullin. But considering, as I already mentioned, it is the young defensemen who usually seem to get the stricter punishments from Ryan Warsofsky, that is probably enough to see him outside of the lineup for the very next game, as unfortunate as it is. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, Desharnais is paired with Nick Leddy. As I said, you expected Nick Leddy to return to the lineup here tonight. It did not look pretty, especially at the start. There was a lack of chemistry between both Leddy and Desharnais. They were missing passes to each other quite frequently in the first period here tonight. It is somewhat understandable because obviously Leddy hasn't played in a while, and even when he was playing, these two defensemen were not on that same pairing. But that doesn't really excuse the mistakes that did get made. However, when it comes to the second period on this second goal, that's where Leddy obviously had his ugliest moments, as we saw him not only give the puck straight up to a Seattle Kraken player right down the middle of the ice, shades of Dmitry Orlov in the last game against Calgary, but then he decides to completely screen his goaltender on the eventual Adam Larsson shot that ends up being the actual game winner for this one here tonight. So it was not a particularly good performance from Nick Leddy, multiple mistakes being made. And, people will bring up the fact, well, everyone's hating on Nick Leddy, but Sam Dickinson and Shakir Mukhamadullin, they also make errors. But the thing is, if you asked me, would I rather watch Nick Leddy make mistakes for the next 60 games of this season or Sam Dickinson make mistakes for the next 60 games of this season? Obviously, the answer 10 times out of 10 is Sam Dickinson, because he is a key future player for this roster, and Nick Leddy is very far from that. Not to mention the fact that if Nick Leddy plays 60 more games, you're not really expecting much to get better from him. He has a ceiling as a player, as a mid-30s type of player. He's not suddenly going to have a career season. Like, you're not going to get much more than like maybe a fifth defenseman level of play, sixth defenseman level of play. But with Sam Dickinson, sure, there are some bumps in the road as of late. There have been some games that maybe haven't been all that great, but he has so much potential. He has so many tools that you never know. He could figure it out as this season goes on. You just go back to last year with Will Smith. He was a player who looked completely lost through the month of October. It felt as though like he was just not ready to play in the NHL, but he was very skilled. He was very smart when it came to his offensive IQ, that eventually, as we got to the halfway mark of the season, he figured it out, and he ended up being one of the Sharks' best players in the final half of the season. Who's to say something similar couldn't happen to Dickinson, that if he is actually given the consistent lineup time, he is given consistent ice time, that eventually, in December, in January, whenever might be the case, that he turns things around and ends up being the Sharks' best defenseman for the final 20, 30, 40 games of the season. That is much more likely to occur than Nick Leddy suddenly finding a second wind here in his career and in actually being an effective top four defenseman. That's simply not going to be the case, but Dickinson, at least there is potential there. So I don't see why I should be forced to watch Nick Leddy make mistake after mistake after mistake with zero hope and zero positivity, when instead I could be watching Sam Dickinson, who may occasionally make some mistakes as well, occasionally have some rough games, but for there to actually be some very real potential here. And then finally, we do have the Sharks goaltender Alex Nedeljkovic. I wasn't that surprised to see him in the nets here. I was maybe thinking that the Sharks would ride the hot hand. Askarov has been spectacular as of late, but I guess Warsofsky doesn't want to try and tire him out and maybe ruin that confidence, so he decides to go with Nedeljkovic, especially since Nedeljkovic was supposed to get the start a couple of games ago, but because of a personal matter, that did not end up happening. It's not as though Nedeljkovic was actually bad here tonight, and I'm not sure if Askarov would have made a difference. Who knows, but I'm not sure. But obviously, he does get out-dueled by Philip Grubauer, who was spectacular in this game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be returning back home on Tuesday after this 3-game road trip that had started off decently well with that game against the Minnesota Wild, but obviously went off the rails a little bit with that one against the Calgary Flames. So we'll see if at home they can kind of find their game yet again and get back into the win column. Class dismissed.